my paper tries to analyze how the prime line between rural and urban settlements can be drawn on the basis of population densities and the level of amenities available. People tend to migrate to cities from villages and contribute towards the migrant population. And urban areas have other categories of settled populations also, namely the nascent population, that is permanent, and the transient population. My paper also tries to analyze that how planning is one of the most vital characteristics that constitute an urban area and assist in planned and homogeneous development of the city. One of the most crucial and basic amenities planned by urban authorities is housing, or units of habitation, with basic facilities like electricity, public health, and water supply. My paper also discusses that ideally, housing should be affordable and proportional to the demographic pressure, but sadly, a skewed housing policy is being followed in most of the cities. The paper also aims to establish the struggles and challenges of urban housing due to mismatch of demand and supply of housing facility, and through case studies, it will bring into discussion the housing solutions to accommodate all types of populations for the future cities in the most sustainable manner. The first topic that I will be discussing is urbanization and the entire need of urban housing. The definition of urbanization varies contextually all over the world. But for reference, we'll quote the definition of United Nations that defines an urban agglomeration as the built-up or densely populated area containing a city proper, its suburbs, and the continuously settled commuter areas. People tend to migrate towards urban areas for better job prospects, for better education, and for better health facilities, or more freedom from the restrictive social and cultural practices at a rural level. According to a report produced by the Population Division of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, that is UNDESA, 55% of the world's population lives in urban areas and is expected to rise to 68% by 2050. According to the United Nations World Urbanization Prospects report, about 34% of India's population now lives in the urban areas. This alarming population pressure calls for a need of housing facilities, which is in proportion to the rapid urbanization. Now, housing is one of the most primary human needs, apart from vital needs of food and clothing for human survival. Better housing is absolutely essential for a better economic and social future, and it not only raises the level of standards, but also health of individuals and reduces the rates of mortality and morbidity. Now we move on to the policy, planning, and potholes involved in urban housing. India currently records an urban housing shortage of approximately 18 million units in the urban centres, out of which 56% are for the economically disadvantaged sections and 40% for the low-income groups. Now, in view of the massive housing shortage encountered in India, ideally the government and other planning agencies are supposed to frame policies and initiate steps to plug the demand-supply gap in housing sector. But
sorry for interrupting, Aeshvarya.
Yes.
You have 20 minutes for presentation. I forgot to tell you I should have in the beginning. Okay? Yes. So keeping the time limit in mind, please emphasize your main points.
Yes.
Civil rights.
Okay. But I was talking about the gap between the demand and supply in the housing sector. But contrarily, there has been a very slow pace of housing development in India. The subsidized public sector housing scheme mostly run into serious financial problems after some years because low-cost income housing needs are so much greater than what governments could afford, and the supply quickly lags far behind. Now, according to a detailed analysis of India's housing pattern undertaken by the Economic Survey 2017-18, a merely 28% of India's city dwellers live in a rented house, which is a steep decline from the scenario of 1961, when a majority of people, like 54% of people, used to live in a rented house instead of owning one. It points out to the declining practice of renting and dramatic rise in the number of houses lying vacant in cities all over the country. Apparently, rent control, unclear property rights, and difficulties with contract enforcement, along with government's encouragement of home ownership through socio-economic policies, have resulted in the present scenario, which has put an additional infrastructural burden on the urban resources. A 2012 government order instructed private and cooperative housing developers to allot 20% of the total dwelling units or DUs in a housing scheme to people from EWS or the economically weaker section and to lower income background people. But surveys indicate that most of these dwelling units under EWS and LIG schemes in the different housing societies have either been sold off at market rates or have not been allotted to the rightful beneficiaries, and the regulatory authorities have taken no concrete cognizance of the same. Resultantly, the lowest rung of the society, that is, the urban poor, they are forced to settle in slums, which are mostly parked on vacant land and are at the mercy of the urban authorities. Now we come on to the reality check of the slums. We take the example of Mumbai and its slums as a case study. Mumbai, wrote V.S. Naipaul, is a craft. India's economic capital and the most populous city, Mumbai, has a total population of 12.44 million, that is 42% of whom lives in slums. Many slums, 42% of people live in slums in Mumbai.
To be higher, anyway, continue.
Many slum dwellers in Mumbai are not the official poor. They do not live below the poverty line, but are well-educated, middle-class people who are deprived of adequate housing. Thus, the existence of slums in Mumbai is primarily a function of failed housing policies combined with other political factors. A new scheme of slum redevelopment had begun in Mumbai in 1995 that prompted private developers to purchase slum land from the government at a relatively low price and redevelop the land through incentive floor space index or the FAR or FSI as we know it. But the scheme faced serious drawbacks like non-compliance of participatory approach while designing the buildings for slum dwellers and non-allocation of dwelling units to all slum dwellers due to the documented ineligibility. Another important factor that we face in terms of urban housing challenge is the transient housing for the homeless or the need of night shelters. At least 1% of every Indian city and town population is homeless, as per the Supreme Court Commissioner's Office estimate. Based on this, 3.7 million are homeless in India's cities, which means 218,750 shelters are needed across the country. Night shelters or the ranbaseras are solution for providing them with transient housing because these homeless people living on footpaths, pavements and below flyovers is entirely different from people living in slums and other habitats because these are nomadic people and represent an informal sector that lives below poverty line. The gravity of the situation presses for the state governments to aim for building sufficient shelters and then proceed to establishing workers' hostels, transit houses, and finally a secure tenured housing for the homeless. Now we come down to the roadmap for the future for providing a housing for all. Apart from shelter provision, housing has great potentiality in the promotion for economic development. It is a good source of national income. It can induce saving and real capital formation. Housing construction is a major employment provider, and any boost to the housing industry in India can go a long way in spreading prosperity, particularly at the low level of workers. By revamping the institutional structure of housing and urban development agencies in the country, like state housing boards, slum clearance boards, and the urban development authorities, focused action on housing for all in a mission mode can be undertaken. India should use excess land held by government agencies like the railways, the ports, the aviation, the SCGs, and defense ministries to meet its goal of providing housing for all by 2022. The government policies should ensure that there is an adequate supply of low-cost rental housing by addressing requisite reforms in the Rent Control Act. Housing construction can be expedited if modern methods like prefabrication are employed in building. Economy can be achieved and housing on a mass scale can be developed through utilizing prefabricated construction techniques. And lastly and most importantly, I'll reiterate that any future attempts at public housing must first and foremost confront the evils of divisive living. where the HIGs or the high-income groups reside in gated colonies and communities. The middle class lurks in clumsy apartments, and the LIG or EWS spend their entire lives in shanties. The integration of housing for the poor and housing for the rich can ideally produce a housing for all.